For 24 years, she silenced attorneys and destroyed lives. But one man flipped the script and had her arrested in her own courtroom. That's not a movie. That's what really happened inside Courtroom 3B, Jefferson County, Alabama, where justice didn't just get delayed, it got bought, buried, and burned alive. They used to whisper her name like a warning. Judge Cynthia Warwick. A woman whose voice never rose above a quiet hum, but who could ruin your career with a single stare. In her courtroom, lawyers didn't argue. They obeyed. Objections weren't overruled. They were erased. She never needed to shout. Her silence was the threat. And that morning, it felt different. The kind of quiet that doesn't settle. It smothers. The walls of the courthouse weren't just brick and wood. They were soaked in decades of fear. Then came Elijah Brooks. Not a big-name attorney. Not some hotshot on TV. Just a 48-year-old black lawyer from the South Side, walking into Warwick's courtroom like he didn't hear the rumors. The ones that said, she hates public defenders. She's never ruled in favor of a black defendant. She'll eat him alive. But Elijah wasn't here to survive. He was here to expose his client, Malik Jefferson, falsely accused of armed robbery, poor, black, forgotten. Exactly the kind of man Judge Warwick loved to turn into a statistic. Warwick barely looked up when Elijah entered. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't nod. Just arched one perfectly manicured brow. As if to say, "You again?" The courtroom clock ticked. 3 journalists sat in the back, pens ready. A rookie prosecutor in a stiff gray suit shuffled papers with the nervous energy of someone who thought he'd already won. And the jury. Half looked like they were already convinced. The other half? Just tired. But Elijah didn't flinch. He placed his briefcase on the table, opened it with care, and pulled out a stack of files labeled in red. State of Alabama versus Malik Jefferson. Everyone else was watching a trial. He was walking into war. And he knew, in this courtroom, truth alone wasn't enough. He would need fire. The moment Elijah stood up, you could feel the shift. Not because he raised his voice. He didn't. He never needed to. He just spoke, calm, clear, with a weight that demanded attention. Not from volume, but from truth. But in this courtroom, truth had no seat. Because here, power always sat at the bench. And today, that power was Judge Cynthia Warwick. A woman who'd spent 2 decades perfecting the art of pretending to be fair while pulling the strings behind the curtain. Elijah had seen it before. He'd stood in front of judges who ignored evidence, who rolled their eyes when a black man spoke, who smiled at prosecutors and scowled at public defenders. But Warwick, she wasn't subtle. She was deliberate. Every time Elijah raised a legal point, she interrupted. Every motion he filed was denied in seconds. No deliberation, no questions. Even the stenographer hesitated, unsure whether to bother typing what the defense said. And the jury. Most avoided eye contact. A few leaned forward, but didn't speak. Because here, everyone knew the rules, even if no one dared to admit them. This wasn't just a trial. It was a script, a courtroom drama where Warwick played the queen. The prosecutors played her knights. And every defendant like Malik Jefferson? A pawn. Prejudged, pre-convicted, pre-condemned. But Elijah didn't play by those rules. When the prosecutor introduced surprise evidence that had never been disclosed in discovery, Elijah stood. "Objection, Your Honor." "Clear Brady violation," he said, referencing the landmark case that required all evidence, exculpatory or not, to be shared with the defense. Judge Warwick blinked once, then leaned back as if bored. "Denied," she said. "No explanation, no justification, just like that. A constitutional violation erased with one syllable." But Elijah didn't sit down. He let the silence stretch. Let the jury feel the discomfort. Let the gallery realize what had just happened. "To be clear, Your Honor," he continued, "you're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation on record." Warwick's jaw clenched. "You're on thin ice, Mr. Brooks," she hissed. "One more word." He didn't blink. "For asking the court to follow the law?" The gavel slammed, loud, sharp, final. "Enough!" But Elijah smiled, just a little, because he knew. She was cracking. And every crack she made under pressure. That was his opening. He wasn't here to win her approval. He was here to reveal her truth. In front of witnesses. In front of journalists. In front of a system that had protected her for far too long. And most importantly, in front of a camera. Judge Warwick didn't just deny justice, she mocked it. When Elijah sat down, her smirk said it all. That thin, satisfied curve of the lips. The kind of smirk people wear when they believe nothing can touch them. She tapped her pen. Once. Twice. Then nodded at the prosecutor, Brandon Lowell, like signaling a dog to fetch. "Proceed," she said. Lowell rose with a smugness that only privilege can breed. Inexperienced, but confident. Not because he knew the law, but because he knew who backed him. He swaggered up to the witness stand like it was a stage built just for him. "Mr. Hayes," he said to the store clerk, "do you see the man who robbed you in this courtroom today?" The clerk hesitated. His eyes darted. He looked at Malik, then at Elijah, then down at his shoes. "Well, I believe so," he mumbled. Elijah was on his feet instantly. "Objection. That's not a positive identification." Warwick rolled her eyes. "Overruled." Elijah pressed on. "Your Honor, the witness admitted he's unsure." "I said overruled, Mr. Brooks," she snapped. "Sit down." The gallery shifted, a soft murmur rising. Even the jury exchanged uneasy glances. Elijah knew what they were seeing. They were seeing the same thing he saw, a trial tipping off its axis. But what came next? That was the turning point. Because Brandon Lowell, desperate to seal the case, reached into his briefcase and pulled out a surprise photo lineup. Photos the defense had never seen. Photos not listed in discovery. Elijah stood so fast his chair screeched against the tile. "Objection. That evidence was not disclosed. I move for a mistrial." Warwick didn't even look up. She flipped a page in her folder and said flatly, "Denied." A gasp. The gallery, wide-eyed. But then, Lowell said something that cracked the courtroom in half. He leaned close to the microphone and said with a smug grin, "Let's be honest. We all know what people like him look like." He didn't say the word. He didn't have to. It hung in the air like poison. People like him. The implication rang louder than any slur. And that's when it happened. The woman in the second row, an older black woman with silver-streaked braids and eyes full of history, stood up. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "You should be ashamed." Warwick's gavel slammed again. "Remove her from the courtroom," she barked. But Elijah didn't move. He didn't need to, because the room had already turned, not loud, not chaotic, just still and watching. Every reporter's pen froze. Every juror leaned in. Every camera lens zoomed, because in that moment, the system exposed itself. And Elijah, he stayed silent. Let the system sink itself deeper. Because the trap had already been set, Elijah stood again. But this time, he didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached down, pulled out a sealed folder from his briefcase, and walked to the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, his voice level, "I'd like to submit Exhibit 17 into evidence." Warwick raised an eyebrow. "And what is this?" Elijah didn't blink. "It's a certified audit, compiled by the State Office of Investigations. Includes timestamps, transaction codes, and direct wire transfers made under Mr. Lowell's supervision to a private account connected to the arresting officer." The courtroom froze. Lowell's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Elijah stepped forward. "The evidence was obtained under subpoena, not from the defense, from a whistleblower, just 3 days ago." Warwick narrowed her eyes. She glanced down at the folder, as if afraid to touch it. "I was not made aware of any such documents," she muttered. "That's because," Elijah said slowly, "the report names you as the judicial sign-off on those very transfers." Dead silence. No one moved. Even the bailiff shifted awkwardly behind the bench. Lowell sputtered. That's nonsense." Elijah turned to the gallery. "I have here." He held up another document. "A chain of emails between Judge Warwick, the arresting officer, and the DA's office, suggesting coordination prior to Mr. Jefferson's arrest." The words hit like thunder. Emails, money trails, timing. It wasn't just about prejudice anymore. It was about corruption. "Your Honor," Elijah said, now looking straight at her, "are you going to deny this too?" Warwick stood, not in power, in panic. "I will not let this courtroom become a stage for theatrics," she hissed. But it was too late. The theater had already begun. One juror leaned forward. Another whispered to the foreman. The camera crew in the back shifted, one slowly zooming in on Elijah. He continued, "I have a signed statement from a court clerk who witnessed the deletion of evidence from the internal system. On your order." Warwick's gavel slammed down again. "This is outrageous!" But her voice cracked, her mask cracking with it. And then, a voice from the back of the courtroom. Firm, deep, familiar. "Let the record show. This trial is over." 2 federal officers entered, badges visible, papers in hand. One walked to the bench, handed her the warrant. The other stood behind her. Elijah didn't smile. He just nodded. Because power, true power, doesn't scream. It exposes itself when it thinks no one is watching. The click of the handcuffs sounded louder than any gavel. It echoed through the room. Final. Inevitable. Judge Cynthia Warwick. The same woman who had silenced defense attorneys for over 2 decades, now stood silent. Elijah didn't move, didn't gloat. He let the image settle. The robe, the bench, the cuffs. "This can't be happening," Warwick whispered. But it was. And for the first time in 24 years, she was no longer the one delivering the sentence. The agents read her rights aloud. Every word, a mirror of the ones she had once delivered with icy indifference. "You have the right to remain silent." Elijah watched her eyes, wide, uncertain, flickering with disbelief. But there was no one to save her now. Not Brandon Lowell, not the system, not the silence. She turned to the jury, as if seeking mercy. But the jury didn't look back. They didn't need to. Truth had already spoken. Lowell, seated just a few feet away, was pale, sweating. He shifted in his chair, unbuttoned his collar. Elijah didn't even look at him. He turned to the bench and spoke, not with triumph, but with authority. "Your Honor," he addressed the substitute judge now seated behind the bench. "Given the extraordinary events, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." The new judge, an older man with a calm, commanding presence, nodded once. "I've reviewed the exhibits, and I've seen the conduct of this court. Mr. Jefferson," he said, turning to Malik, "you're free to go." The room didn't erupt in cheers. No one clapped. No confetti fell from the ceiling. Instead, there was silence. A powerful silence. The kind that marks the end of a nightmare. Malik turned slowly to Elijah, his eyes filled with something between disbelief and release. "I'm free?" Elijah nodded. "You always should have been." Malik covered his face for a moment, shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of everything he'd carried for so long finally being lifted. Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't just about winning a case. It was about restoring human dignity in a place that had forgotten it. Judge Warwick, now flanked by agents, was escorted past the very people she once belittled. Reporters, clerks, even the bailiff who once stood at attention when she entered. Now, they didn't move, didn't stand. They watched, as power fell, one step at a time. And Elijah, he stood tall, not for applause, but because truth doesn't need noise. It just needs space to breathe. The doors hadn't even fully closed behind Judge Warwick when Brandon Lowell's mask began to crack, his polished demeanor gone, replaced by a jittery, sweating man clutching his pen like it was a lifeline. Elijah didn't look at him. Not yet. He let silence do the work. Let the tension ferment. Let Brandon stew in the fear that he might be next. And then Elijah finally turned. The moment their eyes met, Brandon flinched, not physically, but spiritually. "You're awfully quiet now, counselor," Elijah said calmly, his tone deliberate, surgical. The gallery was still. Reporters barely breathed. Even the jury remained seated, as if this wasn't over. Because it wasn't. Brandon swallowed hard. "You've made your point," he muttered. "No." Elijah stepped forward, voice calm but razor sharp. "This isn't about a point. This is about truth. And your fingerprints are all over a system that just collapsed in front of America." Lowell shifted in his seat. "The judge is the one who—" "She didn't plant the evidence in Malik Jefferson's file. You did." A flicker, a flash. His pupils dilated for a split second, and Elijah caught it. "I don't want your apology," Elijah continued, "and I don't want your excuses." He pulled a document from his briefcase. 1 page, stamped. "This is a deposition request. The DOJ already has your name flagged. You either sign and cooperate, or the agents in that hallway come back for you next." Lowell looked around. At the gallery, the court staff, the cameras, no allies, just judgment and justice. "I want a deal," Brandon whispered. Elijah didn't blink, then start talking. The prosecutor's breath hitched. "I wasn't the only one. The funding, the pressure, it goes higher. Politicians, donors, even other judges." He leaned forward. "There's a list." Of course there was. Elijah set the paper down. "You'll write every name, every meeting, every signature." Brandon's hand shook as he reached for the pen. In the gallery, someone whispered, "He's going to flip." And flip he did. What followed was a confession so sprawling, so damning that even the court reporter's fingers trembled as she typed. It was no longer about Warwick or Lowell. It was a blueprint of how justice had been bought and sold. Malik Jefferson, still seated quietly, watched it all unfold. His freedom restored, his innocence proven. But his eyes, they weren't on Brandon, they were on Elijah. Because he now understood, this man wasn't just a lawyer, he was a reckoning. The trial was over, but the war, it was just beginning. Within 24 hours of Brandon Lowell's confession, news outlets across the country exploded with headlines. "Federal judge arrested in courtroom scandal." "Top prosecutor flips, names high-ranking officials." "Justice system in crisis." It wasn't just a courtroom story anymore. It was a national reckoning. Congress members were calling emergency hearings. Donors were pulling out. Elected officials, once proud of their endorsements, now scrambled to distance themselves. Elijah watched it all unfold from his modest office, flanked by stacks of paperwork and a coffee gone cold hours ago. He wasn't celebrating, because this wasn't a victory. It was exposure, and exposure always comes with a price. Across town, Malik Jefferson sat in the park. His ankle monitor gone, but the weight of years still heavy around his chest. Children played nearby, their laughter foreign to a man who had spent his best years chained to a lie. A reporter approached him gently. "Do you have anything you'd like to say, Mr. Jefferson?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the horizon, then down at the small scar on his wrist, a reminder of a suicide attempt from 3 years back. Then he said, "I just want my time back." At the Department of Justice, a new task force was being assembled, not by politicians, but by those who had been silenced. Whistleblowers, public defenders, victims like Malik. They weren't here for revenge. They were here for reform. And Elijah, he was right in the middle of it. When asked by a young intern what gave him the strength to face down an entire system, he paused. Then he said, "You don't need strength. You just need the truth. And the will to stand in it, even when everyone else runs." But not everyone ran. Outside the courthouse, a quiet movement began. Dozens of families, mothers, brothers, children, all wearing t-shirts that read, "Justice isn't blind, but we were." They weren't there to riot. They were there to remember, to reclaim, to say, "Never again." Back in court, Judge Preston Hale, the newly assigned federal judge, announced a sweeping review of all cases handled by Judge Warwick and Brandon Lowell. Over 300 convictions were now under investigation. Some would be overturned, others retried, but all, finally, would be seen. Elijah knew the storm wasn't over. He'd rattled the pillars of power, and power doesn't fall quietly. He'd already received threats, anonymous calls, strange shadows outside his home. But he kept walking, because for every Malik Jefferson who had nearly lost his life, there were thousands more still inside, their stories buried under forged files and whispered deals. And as long as they were buried, Elijah wasn't done digging. The courtroom was quiet now, not with fear, but with reverence. The bench once used to mock the voiceless stood empty. A monument to what happens when arrogance outpaces accountability. But the impact? It kept moving, like ripples from a single stone dropped into still water. A month after the verdict, Elijah received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside, a photo. A young girl, no more than 7, standing in front of a school podium, reading a speech she had written herself. In the corner of the photo, a caption scribbled in marker. "I want to be like Elijah Brooks." He didn't cry, but he held that photo like it was heavier than law books, like it carried the weight of 1,000 unseen futures. At a community town hall in Mobile, Alabama, a retired public defender named Rosa Daniels stood up and said, "I watched what happened in that courtroom. And for the first time in 40 years, I believe change might finally come from within." The crowd didn't clap. They stood in silence, the kind that respects pain and honors perseverance. Meanwhile, Charles Lawson, now facing federal charges, had flipped on 3 state senators. His cooperation led to the resignation of an entire judicial review board. The message was clear. This wasn't just about one judge. It was about every shadow that let her reign unchecked. And Elijah? He kept going. He returned to defending those who had no voice. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. Every time he walked into a courtroom, he carried the names of those who had been silenced. Malik, Zaire, Names that don't appear in headlines, but live forever in the fight. One day, a law student stopped him after a seminar. "Mr. Brooks," she asked, "how do you keep going when justice feels so far away?" Elijah looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Because justice isn't a place, it's a path. And every step we take, no matter how small, pushes it forward." The screen fades to black. Then, a voiceover. "If you've ever felt like the system wasn't made for you, if you've ever stood alone against power and still chose to speak, then this story is yours too. If this story made you feel something, anger, hope, or the urge to rise, that means you're still alive inside. Don't let that fire die." Subscribe to KaYi, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. Because truth doesn't whisper, it echoes. And the next voice that echoes through history might just be yours.